I'm joined today by Coach Charlie Hurd with Northwest Florida State College. And Charlie, I know that you've been reaching out to a number of black players you've coached in the past on the topic of whether or not they've experienced, at a minimum, unconstitutional, nonviolent police harassment. And I'm curious if you wouldn't mind sharing with us the feedback.
Yes, I will. Thank you for having me on, Coach. The first question you sent, have you ever been nonviolently harassed, being asked to show an ID or treated with unwarranted suspicion or any unjustified hostility? Out of the 42 kids that answered, 35 out of 42 have been unjustifiably harassed. The second question, have the police ever threatened to use violence against you when you were unarmed and posed no threat? 22 out of 42 said yes. And the third one, have the police actually ever used violence against you when you were unarmed and posed no immediate threat? The answers were 18 out of 42.
Those are horrifying results. Let's stick with the first question. So if 35 out of 42 former players of yours who were black have at a minimum experienced unconstitutional nonviolent police harassment, and I think it's important for white people watching to understand, you have to connect the culture that permits race-based
Working for us, a combat.
You have to connect the culture that permits nonviolent, unconstitutional, race-based police harassment with a culture that permits race-based violence and murder. And the reason why we're doing this is because it's important that people make that connection, because so many white people look at just the murder of an unarmed black person and imagine to themselves that, or even say out loud that they feel that it's just an isolated instance, as if these things are radically overblown. And that protests and the like are overreactions. And so I'm curious, given that it was 35 out of 42, not to mention the other results you got, do you consider this problem to be isolated, or do you think it's more pervasive and something that we ought to face and deal with?
I don't think these incidents are isolated at all. I think that the problem is, I think people want to view the world in a box, and they're not trying to relearn anything because it's just easier for them to understand. Like, hey, this is what I know. This is what I'm going to go with. I don't want to try and have empathy for anything else, or I'm not trying to understand what that other person is going through because it's what I've been taught. That's just that's just what I've come to find. And I think a story to go with that is I was shopping with my roommate at VCU when I was a graduate assistant. He was a graduate assistant. My roommate was black. We were at Best Buy. I was the one that bought something from the store. He didn't. And the security guard at the front demanded that my roommate show his ID and empty his pockets as if he was suspicious. But he didn't ask me to show my ID nor show my receipt or empty my pockets. And I felt horrified for my roommate, and his response was, it's, just another day, but you could tell he was absolutely mortified too. And I think we have to get down to, if the person really wants to, if white people really want to, they have to be more than willing to break down those boxes that they've learned. And it just takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of self-reflection as well.
Yeah, you're right that it's, one of the biggest issues we have is that virtually every white American today thinks they believe that slavery was wrong and that the enslavers were not good men. Some will still try to justify it and say things like, well, they're a product of their times and that sort of thing. But the vast majority of American white people today do not look back at Jim Crow and slavery and see righteousness. And the problem is that when they see oppression occur today, in order to admit that these things are not isolated, we have to look in the mirror and see ourselves as unrighteous oppressors. And that is a very, very, very difficult bridge to cross mentally and emotionally for white people. It's not a question that we are, as individuals, we are directly participating in oppression. But when we call oppression isolated to make ourselves feel better, we're at a minimum indirectly participating, because we're never going to fix this pervasive issue as long as we continue to deny that it even exists. So, Charlie, I really appreciate your time today. I'm curious if you have anything else to add. I really appreciated the story you shared already, as well as the importance of white people being mentally strong enough to self-reflect, because it truly can't change until we as white people individually have long, hard conversations with ourselves first and foremost. We have to recognize the racism within when it pops up, and we have to self-check. And of course, conversations with others and books and videos. It's certainly, I remember being in college, and I admired Malcolm X, but I found myself fretting about his language. I understand where he's coming from, but his words are so harsh, and it's like I was calling out to, like, I can hear you better as long as you make me more comfortable. And I got past that. Now I could watch Malcolm X speeches all day long with he's one of my favorites. But it's important for us as white people to recognize that whether we were raised inside of a racist family or not, we were raised inside a racist society, and all of us were brainwashed into being at least a little bit racist. And it's incumbent upon us as individuals to fight that bias on an individual level, because it's really the only way it's going to change. White people we have to, as individuals, look into our own heart and have uncomfortable conversations and self-reflect like you wisely advised. Otherwise, this problem is going to just be continual indefinitely, as it has been literally since over 150 years before our nation was even formally founded. So what else do you got for us, Coach?
I would advise my fellow white friends, and in coaching in particular, try your best to have these conversations with Black people instead of receiving it from a white person, because they have direct experience from it. And the racism, it doesn't just start and stop with police brutality. You can racism is in hospitals, education, real estate. Those are just three things that I can think of. Businesses, and applying for jobs. Those are all ways where racism has not so much trickled, but it's a bigger word than trickle, but it's just saturated in all those areas of everyday living. And have an uncomfortable conversation with someone that has experienced such tough times. And if you have the empathy, then just try your best to recognize your white privilege. I'm lucky that I can walk at a street and across the street at midnight, walking by another woman, and she doesn't feel threatened by me. Now that's not the same for the players at Northwest Florida State. And if they're if a 6'11", 240-pound freshman is walking from school to the apartments at midnight, and a woman is walking by him, she's going to feel threatened. That's both that's white privilege, and that's probably a gender privilege as well. So there's nothing wrong with that. I think you just need to identify that, and just identify that, and just have empathy of what other people are going through. And just now is the time to really grow and to strengthen relationships with your Black friends as much as possible, and try to have more Black friends as well, not just for the sake of having a hood card, if you will, but just for your own social justice and just doing the right thing.
Well, you mentioned a couple of points, and one Of course, even if the black person was 6'2" and 175 pounds, a lot of white women, especially after dark, would have found themselves feeling very afraid. I didn't want anybody listening to be like, well, of course she was afraid. The person was 6'11". It's got nothing to do with race. I didn't want any of the listeners to try to go down that path. And then the other thing you mentioned, you said there's nothing wrong with that, and there really is. It's not. You're not a bad person for having been brainwashed. You're a victim of brainwashing. Where morality comes into play is when you're either using your racial bias to actively harm a black person, or you're refusing to recognize your racial bias and your racism so that you can fight against it, right? It's not the having reflexive thoughts and feelings is not something that you can necessarily help. Fighting against those thoughts and feelings is something you can absolutely help if you have the empathy and the mental fortitude and strength to admit that these problems exist in the first place. So, Coach Charlie Hurd, congratulations on the new gig. And I really appreciate you making some time for us and sharing your thoughts. And, of course, we will stay in touch and talk soon.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Coach.